Remember that feeling when somebody says, "Don't worry, we're not touching the original masterpiece," and then immediately walks toward it holding a toolbox? Yeah, that's kind of where The Lord of the Rings: The Hunt for Gollum has everyone looking right now. After almost 25 years, we're finally getting a movie that isn't just somewhere in Middle-earth, it isn't hundreds of years before Frodo. For decades, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy has almost been treated like sacred ground. You know, the kind of thing where everyone looks at it and collectively agrees, maybe let's just not mess with this. Because honestly, those movies are regarded as one of the greatest trilogies ever made. At least one of them regularly shows up whenever people start arguing about the greatest movies of all time. And those arguments usually last longer than the extended editions. Since then, Middle-earth has definitely stayed busy. Peter Jackson came back for The Hobbit starting in 2012. Prime Video launched The Rings of Power in 2022. The video games explored other stories too, but notice something missing. Everything stayed comfortably away from Jackson's original trilogy. Different time periods, different stories, different generations. It's almost like everyone looked at the Fellowship of the Ring and said, you know what, let's leave that exactly where it is. Well, apparently that's over, because The Hunt for Gollum isn't just another prequel, it's set immediately before the events of the Fellowship of the Ring and follows Aragorn searching for Gollum. The story is based on the Fellowship of the Ring itself along with Tolkien's appendices, which already makes this feel much more connected to the original movies than previous spin-offs ever were. And here's another interesting twist: Peter Jackson isn't directing this time. Andy Serkis is. Yep, the man behind Gollum is stepping into the director's chair while Peter Jackson stays involved as a producer, which makes this whole thing feel even more interesting, because you've got someone who knows Gollum incredibly well leading a movie that's literally named after him. Now here's where things start getting really complicated. Simply by existing, this movie changes how people experience the Fellowship of the Ring. Not necessarily because it contradicts anything, it may not contradict anything at all, but context changes everything. Think about it. The Hunt for Gollum takes place right in the middle of the timeline surrounding the Fellowship. It's essentially showing Aragorn during his days as a ranger searching for Gollum, while also exploring Gollum's own experiences, including being tortured by Sauron in greater detail. That means when you eventually watch the Fellowship again, you're not just seeing Aragorn show up, you're bringing an entire movie's worth of extra knowledge with you. You're looking at Gollum differently, Aragorn differently, every conversation, decision, and appearance. Everything suddenly comes with additional context that simply wasn't there before. And that's kind of a huge deal, because Jackson originally chose not to include these events, not because they didn't exist, but because they weren't necessary for telling that story. Now this new film could fill in those gaps. Maybe fans will absolutely love getting those missing pieces. Maybe they'll feel like Middle-earth just became even richer, or maybe some people will think those gaps were actually part of the magic. Sometimes mystery really works. Sometimes not knowing every single detail is exactly why a story feels so timeless. That's the balancing act this movie has to pull off. Then there's Aragorn. Remember how mysterious he feels when we first meet him at Bree? He's this quiet ranger sitting in the corner, and nobody quite knows who he really is yet. There's intrigue, mystery, and a feeling that this guy clearly has a much bigger story. Well, if you've already watched an entire movie about Aragorn hunting Gollum before reaching Bree, that introduction naturally hits differently. The mystery changes. Not because the original scene changes, because you change. You already know far more about him. That's actually one of the most interesting parts of this whole project. Movies don't always have to rewrite scenes to change how audiences experience them. Sometimes all they have to do is add information beforehand. It's kind of funny when you think about it. The movie isn't reaching into your Blu-ray collection at night and editing your copy of The Fellowship. It's editing your memory instead, and memories are surprisingly powerful editors. There's another thing fans are already going to notice. Viggo Mortensen isn't playing Aragorn here, which means if someone decides to watch everything in chronological order, Aragorn could literally change actors within just a few in-universe days. That's going to be noticeable. You'll probably go from one Aragorn to another, and your brain is going to spend 5 minutes saying, hang on, wait, give me a second. Again, that's not necessarily bad. It's just one of those unavoidable things that naturally changes the viewing experience. Now let's talk about something that could end up being the biggest challenge of all, the source material, because this is where things get really interesting. The Hunt for Gollum isn't adapting a massive novel packed with hundreds of pages of dialogue and scenes. It's drawing from material found in the Fellowship of the Ring and Tolkien's appendices. That means the filmmakers are working with a much smaller foundation, and feature-length movies need features. They need scenes, dialogue, conflict, character moments, and momentum, which means Andy Serkis and Peter Jackson will almost certainly have to expand, extrapolate, and invent material to build a complete movie. Now, if that sounds familiar, that's because people have had this conversation before. The Hobbit. That trilogy famously expanded a single book of roughly 300 pages into 3 movies totaling nearly 9 hours. Some viewers loved the extra material. Others felt it became unnecessary padding. Expanded battles, expanded characters, extra material that wasn't originally there. For some fans, that hurt the pacing, and that's exactly why people are looking at The Hunt for Gollum with a little caution. Because if The Hobbit already had an entire book to build from, The Hunt for Gollum has even less source material available, which means it may have to become even more creative. Now, creative isn't automatically bad, let's be fair here. Expanding smaller pieces of Tolkien's writing could lead to something genuinely exciting. It could enrich the story. It could make Aragorn and Gollum even more compelling. It could make moments from the Fellowship feel deeper. Or it could feel like too much was added. That's really the question hanging over this entire movie. How much expansion feels natural? And when does expansion start feeling like invention for the sake of filling runtime? Because there is a difference. One of the biggest reasons this discussion matters is where this story sits in the timeline. The Hobbit was set decades before The Lord of the Rings. It lived in its own corner of Middle-earth. If something felt different, audiences could mentally separate it from the trilogy they loved. The Hunt for Gollum doesn't really get that luxury. It's connected directly to the Fellowship. It's basically standing right beside it, which means every creative decision naturally affects how audiences view the original story. That's a lot of pressure. Probably more pressure than almost any Middle-earth project has faced in years. Because you're not just making another fantasy movie, you're stepping into one of the most beloved film trilogies ever made. Fans aren't just watching to see if the new movie is good, they're watching to see what happens to the old movies after they've seen the new one. That's a completely different challenge. And I think that's why this film feels so exciting. Not because anyone expects it to replace Peter Jackson's trilogy, that was never really the point. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more deep dives into movies, TV, and everything geek culture. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.